This is The Other 51. I'm Brian, and this week, my guest is Julia Azari, a professor at Marquette University and contributor at 538. My guest this week is a associate professor of political science at Marquette. You probably know her best as a contributor to 538 and their podcast. She's a phenomenal follow on Twitter as well. Julia Azari, welcome to The Other 51.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, for your kind introduction.
How's your semester prep going? How's your summer going? This is a crazy busy time for all of us in academia, so I really appreciate you taking the time this week. So how is getting ready for the fall going?
Let's see. It's kind of like I don't even know what the metaphor would be, but one of my favorite GIFs on Twitter, I say GIF, is that wrong?
That's right. No, that's right.
Okay, good. Is the thing where it's like this truck kind of careening down a mountainside and it's on fire. That's sort of like my daily. I'm not going to tweet any more content. I'm just going to tweet that every day. I'm teaching two classes. I'm teaching an elections class. So like I put together a bunch of stuff 2 weeks ago. I have a rule. I don't do any syllabus prep before August.
Okay.
Otherwise, it will take over your whole life. And I'm almost always teaching something I've taught before. I've been teaching for 13 years. But of course, I teach American elections and American presidency. So like your syllabus can go stale pretty fast. Unfortunately, this one went stale in between when I made the readings and today. So I'm trying to figure out how to integrate the mail. I'm trying to figure out how to be. This is probably not answering your question at all and answering it in much more length than you wanted. But I'm guessing a lot of people are dealing with some of this stuff, which is I'm trying to be appropriately critical of the Trump administration while at the same time not alienating students who might be more conservative, who might support the president, and also not turning my class into a partisan fight all the time.
Sure. So how have you negotiated then, or how are you trying to negotiate it? I imagine the past 4 years have been, that's an assumption. Have the past 4 years made that more challenging, or is it something that's kind of always been there and something you've always kind of had to think about and worry about?
I think those of us in Wisconsin have had to jump on some of these national dynamics.
It's true.
Things got ugly here a little bit earlier, I think, than everyone else in the country realized how ugly they were. And our campus is politically, I would say it's politically diverse. I would say our students lean left. What's been new in the Trump years, there's two things I think that have been new in the Trump years. And one is that the conservative students seem angrier. They all seem angry. But the conservative students seem angrier in a way that is hard to square with the fact that there's a Republican White House. And I kind of had my dynamic down in the Obama years where the conservative students were angry. The liberal students, were a lot of them really liked Obama. And so I spent a lot of the class critiquing Obama. And I was like, look, we just critique who's in power.
Sure.
And I'm not going to pretend the liberal students always loved this. They didn't. And I got some nasty evaluations about it with some very interesting assumptions about my beliefs. But, but I felt good about it. And this has been trickier. So that's been one kind of major difference that I've had to deal with. And the second thing I was thinking about in the classroom was more interesting, but I've actually forgotten what it was. So it'll come back to me at a weird time. But that's been dealing with the anger has been really challenging. I did remember the second thing. So the second thing is that the liberal students also will call you out on your BS if they think you're both sidesing. And it doesn't happen often, but it's happened to me a couple times. And then I don't always know how to deal with where you're yeah, I was both sidesing that. Sorry. And I think some of them feel frustrated. The larger dynamic is some of them feel frustrated that the more vocal Trump supporting students are kind of running the show. And the professors are really worried about pissing them off and ending up on one of those websites. And so they're like there tends to be this archetype. Everyone knows these students who like kind of hold court in class, and I think that does impede people's learning. So I'm trying to figure out my classroom and like how we could get away from that environment and actually learn. Um, and I've made it more and more project based. So this semester, the undergrads are going to like run a fake campaign in groups for the second half of the semester, and they can kind of pick who they work with and like what the partisan lean they want to affiliate with. But then they need to use research to actually like tell me what their ad strategy is going to be and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah, I found that too in some of my journalism classes as well. You know, like you said, you always have like the louder, more extroverted students who tend to lead things. And in my classes, they've tended to be, I don't know if it's luck of the draw or the school I'm at or whatever, they've tended to be the more liberal, more kind of progressive voices who tend to be the louder ones. And like I say on the first day, like I don't hide my politics. If you follow me on Twitter for 11 seconds, you know where I land, and that's fine and okay. But so one thing I struggle with, especially when trying to get them to write about politics or write about the election. I'm trying to think of how they can write about the election this coming semester, but it's a challenge because you don't want them to kind of fall back on their pre-existing the pre-existing tropes, their pre-existing beliefs, and you want them to kind of get something original, like you were saying, I think, with a project base. So it is an interesting dynamic to figure out, like, what's a way to approach it, either journalistically or political, or from a political science perspective, that's useful to them and not just kind of regurgitating what they already think they know.
Right. I mean, I think that there's a space between kind of affirming that it's okay for everyone to like have different values and that's fine, and turning college into an exercise of like writing about yourself in a not especially reflective way, which I don't think is valuable for them. That like, tell me your opinion on this issue. Like, no, like this is, you can do that for that's just Twitter.
Right.
So, but this actually leads into an interesting question about public engagement that might be relevant for our main purpose here, which is um, that I agree with the philosophy of not hiding your politics, but the reality is, as someone who participates in a kind of mainstream journalism site, I do hide my politics as a matter of practice for that. I do tell my students that that as you know, as a sort of moonlighting part-time journalist, I try to be fairly balanced on Twitter, or at least not for a side. I wouldn't say I'm balanced, but I'm not for a side. I don't make campaign donations. I don't attend campaign events. Um, so like I vote, and I vote in a way that, you know, I vote how I want. But I don't do anything else politically. So that's, and I tell them that, and I tell them why. And I tell them that if they want to know something about, you know, me or where I stand on an issue, that they can come and ask me in office hours, and I'll be pretty honest with them, but they have to like come to my office, and I'm not going to use class time to talk about my beliefs. And also I do tell them, you know, they're welcome to follow me on Twitter and take what they want from that. Um, I think it's also different. I mean, I think there are certainly some demographics. I have not encountered this with students so much necessarily, but other people certainly assume, I think, that based on I'm youngish, I guess, and female and Iranian American, which might not be obvious to people, but, you know, woman, college professor, under 50, people just sort of assume that my politics are one thing, and I don't really tell them whether or not that's true. But I'm certainly not afraid to criticize anybody in power. And I try to sort of reorient my students that way a little bit.
Right. Well, it's a fascinating discussion. One that comes up in journalism a lot. And you see this a lot on journalism Twitter and political journalism Twitter and political Twitter about the battle of objectivity in newsrooms. And it's something that's been going on in the journalism space, both the academic space, the research space, for a really, really, really long time. Like the literature dates back to that till at least the 80s that I know of, and probably further back. This idea in journalism of whether, you know, you mentioned being both sides earlier, and kind of that balancing out the role of the journalist. Are you objective, and what does objective mean? I mean, everyone kind of has their own little pet meaning or of what they think objective means and what it means in practice for journalism. And I know journalists get criticized a lot for not being objective and for, the both siderisms. But in talking to journalists, like it's interesting to see the why that they do that. And it's funny because it's not always about access. Everyone assumes like, oh, you're just doing this for access, so they'll talk to you. And that's not really the case. And one example of that comes to mind is whether or not you say that President Trump lied about something or call something a lie. And I had a student ask a reporter friend of mine who was a guest speaker in class that specific question, and he acknowledged, it's a great question. And the idea that he had, that I've heard from a lot of journalists, is that a lie indicates intent to deceive, and that as a journalist, I can't be sure that a person is lying or that they're mistaken or incorrect information on that. It's a fascinating conversation of the role of kind of journalism and what they're supposed to do. And I'm wondering, where did your kind of idea, or when you say to students, you don't bring up your personal politics, why is that? Like, where did that come from for you?
So I think it's a variety of different things. Some of it is just like I sort of follow, I would say loosely because I'm a freelancer, but I sort of loosely follow the rules at 538. And I've had some conversations with folks there about how they see it. I mean, they obviously, each person there is different. And they also have just a little bit different background from them or from me. And I've talked to other journalists, and so I kind of follow the lead of different journalists on that. In terms of academics, I also think there are like people in our department take different stances, and people that I am close with professionally take different stances. But I feel like this is sort of an ethos in political science also, is that most of us stand like a little bit outside the fray and whatever. And the Trump presidency has really affected that, I think. But for me, and I'm not claiming I've figured it out, but for me, I guess this is sort of how I see the distinction, is that it's very easy to kind of steam about the Trump presidency. And we see people do that on Twitter, and you sometimes see people or hear about people doing that in the classroom, where it's like, the Trump's tweets are unhinged, or his, things about his sort of affect and aesthetic. And I don't do any of that in public. I try not to, because I want to leave space for those times when I really need to say, no, this is really not okay.
Sure.
And I have written, a number of things at 538 at Mistress of Faction about race and Trump and norms and democratic values. And to me, it's like, what is actually important here? Like, does it matter if Trump is eating a well-done steak? No. Does it matter that his tweets have random capitalization? Fundamentally, no. Right. I want to leave space for like communications people to talk about how some of this matters. Sure. But like in general, no. What matters is policies. What matters is racial inequality, which is something where I think this administration has, failed again and again. And we're also, is building on a very, on a crappy foundation.
Right.
So, that's how I see it. But the other thing I want to bring up in this space, particularly as we talk about the classroom, but also writing, is that, race and gender, and to some extent age, are part of this too. And I think I developed some of this in the classroom because I think that there are some real challenges to establishing yourself as a legitimate authority when you're young. And when I started, I was young. The female instructor in my case on a campus where there were very few women, and particularly in my department, I was one of two women when I started, and I was the youngest member, I think, of the entire university faculty. So that, I wasn't like 16 or anything, I was 27, but I wasn't that much older than some of my students. So I feel like I've spent my whole career trying to establish an amount of credibility that some people get more automatically. Mm-hmm. And and part of that is establishing some semblance of impartiality.
Sure, that makes sense, and it's a caveat that I should have said earlier that I always say when I talk about stuff in the classroom. Like, as a straight white male, I can get away with things, or probably have a little bit more leeway and freedom for not just political expression, but self-expression, and like being, kind of a little bit weird in the classroom, or kind of like, not in a way that like a young female professor or a young professor of color definitely does not get the same leeway that I get. And I fully acknowledge that. So I think that's an important caveat to this conversation at all. But getting kind of to our main idea of public writing and public scholarship, in political science and in journalism. First of all, since you write about this, I'm curious, how many times a day do you get asked who's going to win?
That's a good question. I mean, the pandemic has sort of helped with that because I don't really see anybody. I would say like on average maybe once.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not as bad as it was in 2016. I think maybe people like don't want to hear it because usually when they ask me, I'm like, well, let me explain how economic fundamentals models work for you. And that's a pretty good way. That's like second to like, let me tell you on your diarrhea medicine. It's like getting people not to ask you that question anymore. So, yeah, I haven't, also, I think in some ways, like the horse racy part has been overshadowed by people's panic about the pandemic, and people don't really come to me for public health advice, thank God.
So I'm curious too, like in terms of your public scholarship, and you've been recognized for it and you write widely for it. How did you kind of get into the realm of public facing scholarship? And also, since we're academics, we have to define it. How do you define public scholarship?
As no one's ever asked me that question. That's a great question. So let me give you a long and complicated definition. Now, so I think that the main parts of it for me are creating sort of my own, like public facing intellectual products. And to me, that is applying what I know as a scholar in real time. And again, sort of creating the whole product. There's also a number of people, and I do this too, but I want to acknowledge some people who are real like rock stars at this, who just do tons of media interviews, and they don't necessarily produce a lot of content on their own, but they're really good at speaking with journalists, and see, as I'm like babbling and not able to form a sentence, they can create like a pithy quote and explain things and be the kind of public face of the discipline that way. And then there's social media, which I guess Twitter is the main place where we have these conversations and where people are kind of have open social media accounts. And I think Twitter can be anything from just complete nonsense and toxicity to actually interesting, and probably is the answer to how did I get involved in this.
Okay.
I created a Twitter account in 2013 to help my friend who was trying to build a Twitter following because he was thinking about trying to break into data journalism. And that didn't happen at all, but then I ended up breaking into data journalism, which wasn't even remotely on my radar. So I created a Twitter account and started kind of tweeting back and forth with journalists. I had written and was in production at that time my first and to date only single authored book, which is about presidential mandate claiming. And so that's something that, like, if you're going to talk about a topic that in the journalism world people kind of sloppily throw around, mandates are definitely on that list.
Mm-hmm, right.
So I kind of went in guns blazing, wanting to correct people a lot, and also wanting to promote my book, which came out at kind of an awkward time for a book about presidential elections. It ended up coming out in March of 2014, which is a perfect time for it to come out for me to get tenure. But which was like my only goal for that book. And it succeeded in that realm. I still think it's a useful book, but it just it leaves off before the most interesting case of presidential election interpretation, which
sure.
is, of course, 2016. But so my book came out, and I was asked by my editor at Cornell to promote it and write blogs and op-eds. So I was like, huh. Also, it's important to note that as my book, I had been working on this book forever, for like basically my whole adult life at that point. And then it went into production and I was like, now what? And so in 2013, I trained for a half marathon. And then in 2014, the polar vortex hit Wisconsin. It was too cold to run outside. So I was like, now really what? um, so I started blogging. I started writing short pieces like on the weekend. And this is a sort of sad story now that I tell it out loud. Like, I had nothing to do, so I started writing short pieces on the weekend. And I had like been on a panel with Seth Masket at one point, and so I sort of like I read the Mistress of Faction blog. I don't really know any of them. I had kind of met them all at conferences, but I had just been on a panel with Seth, and I was like, "Hey, I wrote this blog post about my new book," and they published it, and then I wrote a piece for the Monkey Cage where it was one of those moments where, and this is my big tip actually about public scholarship, is something will happen in the news that you've already done a lecture on. Write that lecture up and send it. When Obama appeared on Between Two Ferns, and there was this big uproar about whether that was unpresidential, I had already done a lecture on kind of like presidents pushing the envelope with different forms of media. So I wrote a piece for the Monkey Cage. So I had these two pieces of public scholarship floating around. And Mistress of Faction, the original creators of that blog, so Seth, Hans Knoll, Greg Koger, and Jennifer Victor, were looking to expand, and they just invited me to blog with them. I really have no idea why. I have written one piece for them. How did they know I was not a total Yahoo? How do they know that now? But anyway, I was like, I took this like very seriously. I was like, okay, I've been invited onto this political science blog with these amazing scholars. I need to get my act together. And I started writing a lot for them. And I did mostly that for another year or so and kind of built up a following doing that. Wrote a couple of pieces for journalistic outlets, but mostly that. And then in, I guess the summer of 2015, party politics took on a relevance that I don't think it really had taken on in a year before. I wrote a piece about Bernie Sanders having a clash with Black Lives Matter activists at Netroots Nation in 2015 that got picked up by a bunch of people and got a bunch of views. And I think that's really when that was kind of a turning point. And the Mistress of Faction joined Vox. I answered a tweet by the politics editor at the time at 538 looking for political scientists. And that's how this whole thing took off. So I never set out to do any of this particularly. But here I am.
So why is public scholarship so important? And obviously you have a field that, especially now, is incredibly kind of salient to people, studying the presidency, studying political parties, and obviously my area of journalism tends to be pretty public facing as well. Why is public scholarship so important in these areas? And kind of maybe side question, why do you think it's so, I don't want to say rare, but it feels rare. Like it feels like it's not an essential part of what we as teachers and what we as professors do compared with kind of like the normal book peer review article type thing.
So I think my sense of this is probably somewhat outdated, to be honest. So there's a couple things. One is that I think that creating knowledge really is about people knowing what you've come up with, right?
Right.
Like knowledge really is not anything without people knowing it. And so that's one reason why I think it's important. But the reason actually I think that this took off in 2015 and the way that it became evident this is so important is because our knowledge production process is just incredibly slow.
Right.
And like it takes 2 years, I think, from submission to publication for a book or a journal. 2 years is like a short period of time, right? For most outlets. And some are trying to do something a little bit faster, which is great, but it's so long. And people were really hungry during the 2016 nomination process, I think, for research-based commentary in real time. And that's where I actually think that the work that I've done is real work, and it's not just translation.
Okay.
It's not just like, here's this journal article, let me write up the findings in plain language so that anyone can understand. I think that's important. But I think that what I and other people did in 2015 and 2016 was try to identify what was happening and link it to, conceptual and theoretical frameworks, and identify causation in real time. And that, I think, is a really big part of why public scholarship is so important. I don't really know what the future of this should be, because, I mean, on the one hand, I think knowledge isn't anything unless people are knowing it, and at the same time, it's hard for academics. I think that journals have to be what they are in some ways, right? You need scientific language, memes, you need jargon, and you can't expect people to read that, much less get past the paywall. And I don't know how to solve all those problems. At the same time, it's not obvious to me that all of us need to do this all the time. And it's also, being a public facing scholar means, especially again for women and people of color, that you're going to get harassment at different points, and it's not super fun. And the wider an audience you reach, the more likely it is that things will go awry, or that some weirdo will take notice of you, and it becomes really exhausting. So I have really mixed feelings about telling people to get into it at this point. And this was less true in 2014, and now I feel like the outrage and the toxicity is a big part of this, and is a big part of the Twitter space and the online space, and just bad faith, and just like, there are here, I'm going to both sides of this, I guess, but there's extremists on the left and the right who are bad faith actors in this space, who will find a bad faith reading of your work and will motivate their followers to harass you. And this is not like a daily occurrence, but it's happened enough that I'm like sort of really rethinking a lot of how I engage.
So what do you, when that has happened, and I'm sorry that's happened, obviously that's terrible, but what are some of the ways that you have found helpful to kind of deal with that when you kind of start getting abuse, or start getting not just the usual negative comments, but kind of above and beyond that? What are some of the ways that you handle that?
One of the things that was useful about that is no longer really an option is like the real world off Twitter was a really nice place.
Now that doesn't exist anymore, so.
Right. It's always nice to realize, this crazy thing has been happening on Twitter and everyone's been talking about it for 3 days, and then you log off and you talk to someone who doesn't like live on politics Twitter, and they're like, what are you talking about? This happened to me with my husband in that Harper's letter, where I was like in a big snit about it. I was like, the letter. He was like, the what? He had like heard of J.K. Rowling. I don't think he'd heard of anyone else. It's like, right. Like this, I mean, that was an extreme, and that didn't involve me in any way. No one harassed me. I just feel very strongly about a lot of those issues, but it also had become like a weird toxic space on Twitter. Yeah, so that's been a real struggle in isolation. And yeah, I mean, there's just lots of deleting and lots of blocking, but it's hard when you're also an academic, right? Because like I can't turn my work email off.
Right.
I had a piece in February that got picked up by the left and the right, and I got days of like abusive emails, and like my students had a midterm the next week. I couldn't just turn off my email.
Right. So looking ahead, we're recording this end of August, 2020, and it's the week that the Democratic Convention is, and I'm not going to ask you to predict the future, because who knew we'd be fighting about the mail 2 weeks ago, much less everything else. But as we go into this this election, the presidential election, and obviously everything happened at the federal and local levels. What are the kind of political science storylines that you're interested in? Like the bigger issues, like not just who's going to win, mandates, all that. What's kind of the long term are you kind of interested in when you look at 2020?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I am interested and defend my mandates work. I am actually very interested in what obviously the outcome of the 2020 election, and how complicated will that turn out to be, and what will be the story of that.
Mm-hmm.
Because these things do have a way of being totally, the story that comes out of an election has a way of being totally non-reflective of the reality on the ground of that campaign and like the day after the election. So I will be interested in that. The big political science question, I think, moving into the 2020 election is this sort of question of the economic fundamentals. Political scientists have modeled elections for decades, essentially saying you can get a pretty good read on the two-party vote share based on the state of the economy, and sometimes they add in some public mood kind of factors. Is the country at peace? Like the reason I think that this kind of forecasting is valuable, and so far I haven't been fired from 538 for this, is not so much because I think it's super valuable to predict, like, is this candidate going to win 48 or 49% of the popular vote, but because it tells us something powerful about politics and its orientation toward the status quo. And this question of, are things good or are things not good? And if that drives presidential elections, that tells us something. And so the degree to which, what I'm interested in is kind of the degree to which Trump is able to overperform the abysmal status quo that I think everyone has to agree on right now.
Right.
Does partisanship actually overshadow that incredibly powerful force? So that's one storyline I'm looking for. I'm also looking in, I've tweeted a little bit about this. I have a piece up at 538 today about kind of intra-party dynamics and conventions. But I am really interested in the future of the Democratic Party and the future of the progressive wing within the Democratic Party, and kind of how they'll exert influence and build, and whether or not there's an irreconcilable kind of problem there in terms of, again, this orientation toward change in the status quo. I wrote about this. I also wrote a book chapter about this in an edited volume on it's called The Road to the White House 2020. And I wrote about whether parties are kind of intrinsically conservative institutions. And I think this is a big part of what you see when people talk about Biden and Harris as centrists. Like, objectively, they're not really centrists. They're very different kinds of Democrats than like the Bill Clinton era.
Sure.
But they are interested in preserving the status quo, right? That is the fundamental project of, I think, both their presidential candidacies. So even if like they and the Sanders-Warren camp both agree that like more people should have health coverage and the government should have a role in that, that's a pretty substantial commonality. But the notion of like the system is fundamentally good and should be preserved versus the system is fundamentally unequal and should be altered at its foundations, I wonder if that is irreconcilable.
Right.
So that is that's that storyline. And the third one is, for me, and I don't know that this will be the 2021 or 2025 or who knows, but the post-Trump GOP.
Mm-hmm.
Those are my incredibly niche interests in 2020.
Well, to give you one more to think about, something I was thinking about, and you guys kind of hit on this on a chat that you did at 538 a little while ago. From a journalist perspective, I'm really interested in election nights and the day after the election, because we have this norm in journalism and the routines of from staying late and having election night pizza and all that, to declaring a winner and the speech and the next day and kind of all of that. And by all accounts, given the, especially with COVID-19, with the number of mail-in ballots that are going to go and the number of kind of absentee ballots that are going to go, Are we going to, is there going to be that declaration on election night that, Biden or Trump have won? Are people going to wake up on Wednesday to nobody having declared victory, not necessarily because of any shenanigans or contestations or close races, but just because all the votes aren't counted yet? And I think that's going to be really interesting for me to see how kind of like the mainstream news and political reporters kind of handle that if there's not a winner to declare for no other reason than there are no votes, then they're still counting the votes. Again, not like a 2000 situation where it's chaos, but just because things are different because of the election mechanism. So I'm interested to see how that plays out, and then the reaction to that reaction is just going to be fascinating to kind of see.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think 2000 is the right comparison. We should all probably be trying to write our 2000 piece um, about not kind of knowing the outcome and about changing up our kind of process and norms. I've been thinking about that too. I'm very attached to election night pizza, and I'm very disappointed that I won't spend this election night. Most likely, I don't think I'll spend it either with my colleagues at 538 in New York or with my students on campus. And I've spent every election um, since 2010 in one of those two arenas. I won't be in an election party. I mean, I realized a while ago I was never going to an election party again. You probably had the same realization where you're like, nope, this is a work night for me. But um, but like not having the social aspect of that is really hard. And yeah, I'm really attached to that ritual. And it will be weird to both be alone and isolated and also be like, well, they're still counting mail-in ballots. Um, I mean, we got a taste of that. I think it's important to remember in 2018 in Wisconsin,
Mm-hmm.
right? When the mail-in ballots changed the election at or changed they changed the count at like at midnight. And I think that's I think the bigger picture, as I think about how to frame that, is that democracy is hard and takes a lot of work. And I think people in our age bracket who came up in the 90s um, came up in a world that was like, I've been thinking about the 90s today for some reason. It's like a little trivial, right?
Right.
And do you think that's fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was no, we weren't thinking about like now as I think back on my college years, like my students right now are 30 times more active and informed on politics than we were. And part of that is media, the proliferation of the internet and of social media. And so they can know more, they can activate more. But it was also like, I guess the big example would be the Clinton impeachment. But when you look back at what the stakes were, they seem so incremental, and trivial is a great word for it. Like, it feels like everything we're talking about now in politics and journalism is so more substantial and bigger issue than we were when I was in high school and college.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel. I mean, I was I guess a freshman when Clinton was impeached and a junior in the 2000 election, and these were like huge political events. But and I was like talking with about the impeachment with my students all last fall. It's kind of like, I was your age when Clinton was impeached, and they were like, "What was that like?" And I was like, "Eh."
Yeah.
It was. I tried to explain that, and I've also written a little bit about it was kind of like the Clinton impeachment got overshadowed by a lot of things, but how it actually did have some lasting impact on politics. But even I think before that, through the 1990s, was this like, politics was just something people did somewhere else, and like a lot of these kind of media tropes that we grew up with are very much like we have to create some ceremony around this to try to get people interested.
Sure.
And that's a totally different dynamic now. So, and I think you're totally right about, our students are 30 times more engaged. I mean, it is, like I said, I think our professors were really hard pressed to get us to care about either of those two events. And I even wasn't that concerned about them. And I was pretty involved and pretty sure I was going to be working in this with something to do with this for the rest of my life.
So I ask everybody I have on my podcast this question, so I'll ask you, what's the best thing you've read lately?
This is the best thing I've read lately. Okay, you're going to totally expose that I am so behind on reading everything, and it's Monday morning, and I'm so freaking tired. Let's see. What form are you looking for in terms of length?
To make it even harder for you, literally anything. It could be a blog post to a book. While you think about it, I will talk about, I'm reading Range right now by David Epstein, which is a book. It's his second book, and the subtitle is How Generalists Thrive in the World Instead of Specialists. And so it's one of those kind of like, it's better than Malcolm Gladwell book, but that's the genre of book where kind of looking at, you know, why the rush to specialization among kids or among scholars or whomever can really be limiting, and how a more like general wide-ranging approach can be as effective for sports, kids, education, whatever, kind of, you know, fill in your own blank here. And so that's been an interesting read. There's been some really cool stories coming out of that, and some cool kind of rethinking of things as I get ready for the class to teach again next week. So
nice. Yeah, I've been reading. I've been trying to put stuff together for my syllabus too, and that's probably the answer. I've also been like working on my one of several APSA papers for our upcoming conference. So like in terms of, can we define lately really broadly also?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So I read a bunch of books earlier in the summer, and one of the books that really stands out to me, and we interviewed on the podcast that I do, is Kenesha Grant's The Great Migration and the Democratic Party. I've been thinking a lot about that. I've been reading a lot about a lot of scholarship about race. I've been kind of behind on reading the sort of, you know, Atlantic pieces that everyone is reading, and reading like bits and pieces of different books. The other book I would recommend to everybody that I read not long ago is Caitlin Jewett's The Primary Rules, which is an academic book about like how, as this title suggests, parties change their primary rules. But it's written, you know, it's just very well written, and it's very clear. And it's like all these questions that everybody has about, you know, how the hell does any of this work, and does it really matter? And she just really, you know, gathers a lot of data and lays it out, and it's just a really fabulous book. So I wish I had a more like hipster, I read this thing on this website sort of answer, but it's actually been a very booky summer for me, and those are two books that I really enjoyed.
Excellent. Well, I'll have links to all of those in show notes if people want to check them out, as well as links to your stories and your work. So Julia, this has been awesome. Thanks so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to The Other 51. Show notes for this and all of our episodes can be found at sportsmediaguide.com by clicking on the Other 51 tab. If you like the show, please consider giving it a rating and a review, either at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help people find the show. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.